Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to our webinar today on Cookstove projects, how to assess project integrity. Before we begin, I would just like to quickly go over some house rules. Firstly, all attendants are muted by default. Should you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can during the Q&A portion of the webinar. As a reminder, the webinar slides and recording will be available tomorrow on the Trove Research website. I'm now going to hand over to Tristan Loeffler, who will introduce today's speakers.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks everyone else for joining. We're really excited about this webinar and very glad that you could all be here today. Just to introduce the panelists quickly from the Trove side, firstly, we have myself. I'm Tristan Loeffler. I head the Carbon Credit Integrity team at Trove. We have Anubhav Joshi, one of the senior analysts within our integrity team, who previous to Trove spent over 6 years running and developing Cookstove projects in India, which delivered Cookstoves to over 32,000 homes. We also have Teresa Bodner, our head of nature-based solutions at Trove, who has a PhD in forestry. I'm also delighted to say that outside of the Trove team, we also have some really great guest speakers who are within the clean cooking industry themselves. So we have Molly Brown, the head of carbon strategy at Burn Manufacturing, and we also have Ken Newcomb, the CEO of Sequest Capital. So we're very excited to say that we'll have all of those great speakers speaking towards the end of the event. I'll now hand over to Guy Turner, our CEO and founder, to kick us off.
Hi everyone. Thanks, Tristan, and great to see everybody or hear everybody, or hope you can hear us on the across the ether. For those who don't know about Trove, I suspect that's a diminishing number of people as time goes on. We exist to provide greater data intelligence and transparency in the whole world of corporate climate commitments and their use of carbon credits. We have teams that span the entire sort of marketplace. We look at policy and guidance in a lot of detail. We monitor all the carbon credit projects and transactions from thousands of projects around the world. We also track the prices that these credits are trading at on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis across many sub indices. We also track the commitments of over 6,500, 10,000 firms, and we forecast carbon credit prices going out into the future as well across multiple different project types. And lastly, and the purpose of today's webinar is part of our carbon credit integrity assessment service and platform that forms part of the Trove intelligence suite of services. And that about covers us. And just on the next slide. Just in terms of the agenda for today, we'll start off with an introduction to clean cooking for those who are not familiar with the subject, but we'll skip through that pretty quickly. And then an overview of the market itself for clean cooking projects, and then into the integrity considerations that are being thrown around the market at the moment. And finally, some conclusions, recommendations for action, and finally then a panel discussion with our guests that were introduced earlier. And now I will hand over back to the team to take you through the first section.
Anubhav, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Thanks, Guy, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. Before we get into the details, we must understand why clean cooking is important. Now, over 2.5 billion people worldwide currently use polluting fuels for domestic cooking and heating. This not only has a detrimental impact on health, but also contributes to 3% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon finance clean cooking projects aim to address this global problem by transitioning communities from inefficient cooking methods. Now, if we look at the numbers, currently there are 650 registered projects in the voluntary carbon market that are enabling communities to adopt cleaner cooking methods. These projects have collectively issued over 30 million credits in the last 2 years, which comprises 5% of total credit issuances. In sync with the scale of the problem mentioned in the previous slide, there has been a huge surge in the pipeline. There are over 750 projects which are awaiting final registry clearance, and according to our own estimates, such projects will represent 12% of issuances up to 2030. Now, the underlying principle to reduce emissions in clean cooking projects is based around efficiency gains in comparison to the baseline stove. Baseline stoves, which are commonly freestone fires as seen in the picture, are replaced with improved cook stoves of higher thermal efficiency, which means lesser fuel will be required by the families to generate the same amount of heat for cooking. Now, as a result, the projects will achieve reduced emission from lesser fuel consumptions. This will consequently reduce local deforestation in areas where families look for firewood collection. Apart from the emissions impact, better combustion of fuel in efficient cook stoves improves indoor air pollution indicators as well, which has a direct impact on the health of communities. Gender benefits such as reduced time for collection of fuel wood and creation of new project-based jobs are also commonly observed. Now with this, I hope everyone has got a gist of the clean cooking project scenario. And now I request Teresa to give us an overview of the market today.
Thanks, Annabeth. So clean cooking projects are concentrated in areas where there's still, as Annabeth described, a high usage of inefficient open fires for cooking purposes. As you can see on the map here, these tend to occur in developing markets, with the majority of projects located in Africa and Asia. In terms of actual numbers of projects, the top 5 markets are India, Rwanda, China, Uganda, and Kenya. India alone has 255 registered projects, and 160 more are currently in the pipeline. The majority of the clean cooking projects are registered with gold standard, though if you look into the middle part here, you can see that there's a mixture of the actual methodologies used. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, we've displayed the interesting distribution in the actual size of the individual projects. The majority of clean cooking projects are micro to small scale ones that issue fewer than 10,000 credits annually. So it almost looks like an inverse exponential curve, decreasing the further you go to the right, so the larger the projects get. The market for clean cooking projects has been growing strongly. Particularly in 2022, we saw a very strong growth in the number of issuances and retirements from this particular project type. This growth has meant that in 2023 so far, over 10% of total market issuances came from clean cooking projects. And as Annabeth mentioned earlier, we expect this to continue given the number of projects that are currently in the pipeline. Now, last but not least, on the general introduction to the market of clean cooking projects, obviously there is the question of price. Trove's index on prices shows that clean cooking projects tend to achieve higher prices than average when compared to the rest of the market. We've seen growth in this price, in these credits, especially in recent months, with the average pricing of clean cooking projects reaching above $10 a credit over the past 6 months. This compares to a price of about $9.3 per credit for the previous 6 months. So there's definitely interesting developments happening, which means now I'll hand you over to Tristan to introduce the key integrity considerations when it comes to these credits.
Thank you, Teresa. And hopefully a lot of people on this call don't need sort of reminding why integrity is such an important issue in the voluntary carbon markets. Integrity is one of the really key challenges the market faces in terms of scaling up, and clean cooking projects are not immune from these integrity concerns. As part of our integrity assessments at Trove, we evaluate project integrity very comprehensively across the market. We've assessed the integrity of over 4,000 registered projects. And when we do so, we look at 5 main criteria. Firstly, there are some criteria around the mission's impact integrity of the credits and projects themselves. So key concerns here are in terms of additionality, quantification, and permanence. But other factors we also consider and evaluate are around the implementation integrity. So how did that project reduce or remove that CO2? And here, crucial components of this are in terms of the co-benefits, the environmental and social impacts of the project, beyond just the carbon impact, and also legal and ethical considerations and risks. And when we evaluate Cookstove integrity, all of these factors are key ones that we evaluate. As part of Trove's integrity assessments, we've evaluated nearly 400 clean cooking projects in detail, which positions us as one of the most comprehensive providers in terms of assessing integrity in this market. We would love to go through some of those findings from all of that work that we've done in terms of clean cooking integrity assessment. But before we do, I'll hand to Anubhav to go through some of the activity chain, which starts to bring out to life some of the key risks associated with these projects.
Thanks, Tristan. Now, as Tristan said, clean cooking projects are not simple. And before we get into the details of how we assess Cookstove project integrity, it is useful to think about the activity chain for a Cookstove project. Now, backed with my own experience of developing projects on the ground, I can confidently say that Cookstove projects involve a complex multi-step process. This process starts with selecting the ideal choice of stoves to meet the need of the end users and deciding how to manufacture or source them. Secondly, once the stoves have been procured or manufactured, they need to be distributed to the end users, who then need awareness and training on how to best use the stoves efficiently. And finally, once the stoves are with the end users, it is important that they continue to be used and their use is effectively monitored and reported by the project developers to accurately measure the emissions impact. So now throughout this activity chain, there are a number of key risks that can impact the success and outcomes of projects. Like, for example, on stove design, if the stove is not compatible with local cooking habits, for example, a non-flat pot support is provided in areas where flatbread is the main diet. For example, in areas of Central America or South America where they cook tortilla in cook stoves, then this can lead to stoves not being used or the improved cook stoves being used in addition to the baseline stoves, a concept also commonly known as stove stacking. Risks with distribution may lead to stoves not reaching the households most at need of them. This generally occurs when there's no specificity in targeting the end user group. Now, for the households that do receive the stoves, key risks center around continued usage of improved stoves without breakages. That means, are the maintenance mechanisms in place and the accurate monitoring of key stoves parameters such as thermal efficiency in the successive years. Now, there are a lot of risks apart from these, and these risks feed into the building of what we call our integrity assessment criteria, which Tristan will further explain in the next slide.
Thanks, Anubhav. And as Anubhav said, there are a number of sort of key risks associated with Cookstove project integrity, and our integrity assessments really focus on the key drivers of quality and key topics that impact integrity overall. As you can see from this slide, there are over 20 key evaluation topics we look at. And as part of our integrity assessments, we've evaluated each of these topics for nearly 400 clean cooking projects. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through these one by one, but I would like to put a spotlight on a few of the most important factors. Firstly, in terms of barriers to adoption. So a really key concern here in terms of proving additionality is the extent to which the population which the project's providing cookstoves to faces significant barriers to adopting efficient cookstoves without carbon credits. So a really key consideration here is to what extent has that target population faced barriers, whether that's sort of financial barriers in terms of not having the income or wealth to purchase those cookstoves without carbon credits, or more access barriers in terms of not being close enough to the markets for those efficient cookstoves. Secondly, there are a number of topics that we consider when we look at quantification. And one of these is in terms of the estimation techniques that the project's used. Quantification of cookstove emission reductions involves a lot of different steps and a number of different quite hard to measure assumptions. And it's an important consideration that projects and project developers use the most scientifically robust techniques for making key assumptions, as the evidence has really proven that the more scientifically robust techniques, such as kitchen performance tests, do fundamentally lead to lower levels of inaccuracy and uncertainty. Another key assumption that we look at and evaluate ourselves is in terms of the fraction of non-renewable biomass, also abbreviated as FNRB. Annabab will talk through this in more detail later on, but this is a really crucial assumption that can really determine the success and accuracy of a project's quantification. When we evaluate this, we really look at the accuracy and appropriateness of a project's FNRB assumption in a number of different ways. On the co-benefit side, Cookstove projects deliver inherently a number of important positive co-benefit outcomes impacting a range of SDGs. Even though all projects do tend to deliver high co-benefit outcomes, these benefits can be even more emphasized by a couple of factors. Firstly, if stoves have been locally manufactured, they will tend to support local job creation and the local economy in a more robust way. And secondly, in terms of how women are involved in the project activities themselves, if women have been involved in the manufacturing or distribution, again, that can really even further enhance the gender outcomes that all Cookstove projects achieve. Now, we'd love to go through some of the findings and insights from our work on each of these criteria when we've been looking at clean cooking projects. And let's start with additionality. So overall, when we look at Cookstove projects and all of the projects that we've assessed in this space, actually clean cooking projects perform very highly on additionality. We see over 70% of clean cooking projects that we've assessed have achieved either a good or high integrity score based on additionality. And the reasons here really come back to that point I was mentioning earlier in terms of barriers to adoption that exist in many developing communities. The cost of purchasing a improved cookstoves without any carbon credit subsidies can be as much as $30 per stove, which is simply unaffordable for many communities. Therefore, projects that target end user populations that face high barriers to adoption and use carbon credits to significantly subsidize or even provide stoves for free can really impact and help overcome those barriers to adoption and ensure that the usage and adoption of more improved efficiency cookstoves can really flourish in those communities. And those are really the key sort of green flags that we see. On the other side, where projects are maybe less transparent in terms of exactly the community they're targeting, or if they don't provide enough information on the extent to which prices are being subsidized to end users, then these can be bigger integrity concerns and risks that we see. As I mentioned in the previous slide, there are a lot of inherent barriers that exist for many of these projects. And a couple of drivers of these are based on the sort of the location and scale of the project. So, for example, in general, rural communities do face higher barriers to adoption based on having less access to the markets in which improved cookstove projects exist. Similarly, projects located in least developed countries, on average, tend to have lower income levels and therefore higher financial barriers to adoption. And when we look at the distribution of cookstove projects, the vast majority are located in areas where we think they have the highest inherent barriers to adoption, but actually only 33% of credits come from projects located in these areas. And that's very much not to say that projects located outside of these areas are not additional, but when we're assessing the integrity of them, we really want to see more evidence provided by projects that don't necessarily have high inherent barriers based on their characteristics. And I'll pass on to Annabab to talk about the quantification.
Thanks, Tristan. Now, when we come down to quantification, we realize that quantifying the emission reductions from clean cooking projects involve a number of calculation steps, as we can see in the screen. Many of these assumptions are hard to measure and subject to high uncertainty, creating challenges when it comes to accurate quantification. Now, if we look in this quantification process, there are three key components where we have seen the most risk and variability. Firstly, if we look at quantity of woody biomass saved per improved cook stove, here the variability mainly emerges from the various methods applied to measure baseline fuel use and thermal efficiency values. Secondly, fraction of non-renewable biomass, which Tristan highlighted earlier. I'll be further dwelling on this part in the next slide. Finally, uncertainty assumptions such as stove usage factor or stove loss. Here, key risks are associated with projects which use overtly optimistic values or fail to properly monitor on-ground conditions as to what is happening with these assumptions. Now, if we look at FNRB rate, before dwelling into the details, a project's FNRB estimates the amount of woody biomass saved that was non-renewable. Now, when we say non-renewable, it means the proportion of woody biomass that did not come from sustainable sources. In our extensive review, we have assessed the FNRB assumptions from nearly 400 clean cooking projects and compared them against a set of country-specific estimates from third-party data, including a range of academic sources. Now, if we look at this chart carefully, the range of project estimates are shown within the box plots for each country and compared against the academic estimates, which are in purple triangles, and the default values allowed by the VERA and the UNFCCC. Now, for example, if we take the case of a country like Malawi, while the project FNRB assumptions range from 80% to 91% across all projects in Malawi, the academic averages and the VERA new default are in the 30% range. So we can see that there's a difference between what the projects use and what the third-party benchmarks are. Now, previously, all projects relied on default values provided by the UNFCCC, which generally ranged from 80 to 99%. But today, most of these default values have crossed their applicable validity periods, meaning that the newer projects must calculate their FNRB rate themselves or use a 30% default value. However, the surprising find was that we did not see a single instance of this updated value being used. Now, in contrast, the majority of project estimates, as we can see in the chart, are significantly higher than both academic estimates than the new default value. Now, owing to these factors, we can see that clean cooking projects face a number of inherent challenges with regard to quantification, which can lead to overestimation of emission reductions. Our analysis does show that the majority of cookstove projects face very high risk regarding their quantifications. However, there are some green flags which the high integrity projects do represent. And given the key assumptions are hard to measure and subject to uncertainty, projects that use best practice techniques to estimate key assumptions are conservative in their uncertainty deductions and make assumptions that are backed with third-party benchmarks represent those projects which have the highest integrity. While on the other hand, quantification risks can occur when the project relies more on default values than actual in-field measurements and irregular monitoring of key parameters. And these fall more under the red flags, so as to say. In particular, the use of outdated FNRB default values, overestimation of fuel savings, or a lack of mitigation plan for stove stacking risks. Now, one more thing we realized was, though there's a theoretical risk of double counting if cookstove projects lie within a RED Plus project area, but we haven't seen even a single instance of this happening with the current registered projects. So with this, I'll now invite Teresa to speak a little bit on permanence.
Thanks, Annabeth. So regarding permanence with clean cooking projects, the idea is that by reducing the amount of biomass that's used for the cooking purposes, cookstove projects can reduce the amount of local deforestation that occurs to provide this very fuel wood. However, any reduced deforestation achieved due to these very projects may be subject to other drivers of deforestation that represent indirect reversal risks. These drivers may be human, but they could also be nature-based, such as from wildfires. As clean cooking projects do not compensate for these permanence risks, you can see that we do classify this as some indirect permanence risk associated with these types of projects. Having said that, this is also why best clean cooking projects generally mitigate at least the more human-based drivers of deforestation through A, robust community engagement, and B, a well-designed stove maintenance and replacement plan. Back to you, Annabeth.
Thank you for that. Now, if we look at co-benefits and And as mentioned in the previous slides, on top of the emissions impact, Cookstove projects can deliver significant co-benefits, as we've seen in the charts here. The vast majority of Cookstove projects that we have assessed score very highly on their co-benefit scores, with nearly 250 scoring 4 out of 5. The best performing Cookstove projects will produce stoves locally and involve women in key parts of the project implementation process, as we have marked in the green flags. Now, further, we've seen that these benefits will also be quantified and monitored on an ongoing basis, which is a thing that good projects regularly do. However, we also suggest that improving the monitoring of these SDG outcomes is a key area of improvement for future Cookstove projects. Now, when we look at the connection between the impacts of Cookstove projects and the attainment of sustainable development goals, we see that the Cookstove projects definitely aid the attainment of many sustainable development goals. Almost all Cookstove projects will improve health outcomes through reduced pollution or support better gender equality through the time and resource savings, in which women are the primary beneficiaries. They also aid in the creation of local jobs in certain projects through distribution work or through manufacturing. However, even though most projects deliver these benefits, not all projects claim these benefits directly, and even fewer quantify and monitor these outcomes in successive crediting periods. Now, this is one area that we want future project developers to focus in, and I'll now invite Tristan to discuss the legal and ethical risks.
Thanks, Anubhav. And in terms of our legal and ethical risks, really just to recap what legal and ethical risks try to assess here, is they're trying to bring a more holistic view of what are the reputational risks associated with a project, by looking at what is the behavior that the project or product developer has been involved in, and to what extent does that meet our legal and ethical standards. Now, there are two real key components to this when we're looking at legal and ethical risks. Firstly, in terms of any financial crime risks associated with the project developer, where we screen all project developers against sanctions, PEP, watch lists, and adverse media databases, and also in terms of more corruption risks at the country level. Now, when we look at clean cooking projects and the legal and ethical risks associated with those, overall, we thankfully see the majority of projects do score well in terms of having good or very high integrity scores here. Though there are some exceptions where we find some financial crime risks associated with developers, which are clear watch outs for potential buyers and investors in this space, the majority of projects, the majority of project developers perform well. And so that's our summary of each sort of criteria by criteria in terms of our findings and assessments on Cookstove project integrity. And so what have we learned from this? As we went through, there are some really, really strong benefits of Cookstove projects that can mean that they can deliver significant emissions impact and co-benefit outcomes across the world, particularly in terms of additionality and co-benefits. Clean cooking projects have real strengths here, and they're some of the most high performing project types that we see compared to all of the projects we've assessed as part of our integrity assessments. Clearly, there are some risks in terms of quantification, as we've mentioned, but overall, clearly the picture does differ a little bit criteria by criteria. And what this variation in the criteria scores really means is that the overall attractiveness and value of a clean cooking project is going to be highly dependent on your preferences. At Trove, we really don't believe that there's only any one-size-fits-all approach here. We understand that many stakeholders might put even more emphasis on co-benefits as some of the emissions impact outcomes, whereas for others, maybe emissions impact only outcomes are the only things that should be weighted. Our integrity assessments tool allows users to flexibly see the overall scores based on these preferences. And as you can see from this slide, the choice of those preferences and the choice of weightings can significantly impact the overall attractiveness of clean cooking projects. So for example, if high co-benefits is the weighting used, you see a significant proportion of projects within the good or very high integrity brackets, whereas if emissions impact only weighting is used and more emphasis is put on things like quantification, then there is more variability in distribution here. So to summarize, what are our key recommendations for the clean cooking market? As we've talked about, there's huge potential here in terms of not just the emissions impact integrity, but also some of the social and environmental outcomes of these projects. And we've tried to think about what we would recommend to different stakeholders within the market to make sure that these benefits and outcomes can be best achieved. And so for buyers, our starting point is, particularly when you have concerns over some of the quantification elements of it, there really is an option here of considering to buy more than one credit to offset 1 tonne of CO2, particularly given some of the price levels of clean cooking projects. Even if you think that a project may have overstated its emission impact 2 times, then buying 2 credits of that can be a really great way of maximizing the use of your dollars. Secondly, for buyers, as we mentioned, there is a lot of variability here in terms of Cookstove project integrity. And so it's imperative that you do good due diligence to identify the most high performing projects. And using tools such as Trove's integrity assessment tool can be a really effective way of doing this. Finally, for buyers, as always, we would just recommend use a diversified portfolio. You should not be placing 100% of your eggs in any basket, and that's definitely the case with carbon credits too. Particularly given the co-benefit outcomes of these projects, then we do think that clean cooking credits can be a really great thing to have in any portfolio. For project developers, clearly in terms of some of the quantification risks, it's imperative that they are conservative with some of the assumptions and ensure that your monitoring is robust and regular to ensure that that quantification risk is minimized. Secondly, as Anubhav mentioned earlier, the co-benefit outcomes can be huge here, but we see a lot of variability in the extent to which projects actually emphasize and measure these. It should be something that all project developers do in terms of monitoring and measuring and quantifying these outcomes. Finally, as always, we would say be very transparent. This is again an area where we see a lot of variability in terms of the transparency of which projects talk about how the carbon credits are being used, who's being targeted with the Cookstoves, and other key things that are important to drive quality in the industry. Finally, for registries and methodologies, I think needless to say, it's important that they regularly update methodologies and ensure that methodologies are following the scientific best practice. Secondly, in terms of some of the key assumptions, providing projects with more up-to-date, regionally specific benchmarks, and even sometimes maximum limits can be really great ways of allowing projects to minimize quantification risk themselves. And finally, going back to the point on co-benefits, for registries and methodologies to provide more guidance on this to project developers to ensure that those outcomes are best quantified and monitored going forwards. And so that's some of our recommendations for the clean cooking market. And next, we would love to go to a panel discussion where, as I mentioned earlier, we're very lucky to have a couple of great guests from within the clean cooking industry. Firstly, we have Molly Brown, who's head of carbon strategy at Burn Manufacturing. Burn is one of Africa's largest cookstove companies and carbon offset project developers. It's an end-to-end cookstove company which has R&D, manufacturing, distribution, and carbon financing all done in-house. And their 2 factories in Kenya now produce over 250,000 stoves a month. Secondly, we have Ken Newcomb, the CEO of Sequest Capital. Sequest has been developing and implementing these projects since 2010, and headquartered in the US, it's issued more than 13 million credits in the last couple of years. It has almost 60 projects across Africa, Asia, India, and Central America, and is, together with Burn, one of the key players in this space. Firstly, I'd like to welcome the panelists. Thanks so much for joining, and it's great to get your thoughts on the industry.
Well, thank you very much. Very much appreciate the effort you've put into this seminar, and it's great listening to the emphasis on the social impact.
Great.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Molly. I think where we'd love to start in terms of questions is in terms of some of the quantification risks that we mentioned. I think the first question we would have, which I'd love to get your thoughts on, are, I mean, what do you think the biggest things that the industry can do to better mitigate these quantification risks going forwards? And maybe, Molly, we could start with you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's worth saying that the kind of key a driver, I suppose, with a lot of the quantification processes sits with the methodologies. And I know that CCA, the Clean Cooking Alliance, is actively working very closely with UNFCCC and Gold Standard. And I know Vera's going through a very similar process to tighten up the methodologies as they stand. And at Burn, we really support this because it's all very well for one Cookstove project developer to take on kind of higher integrity levels of things, but actually as a sector, we really need to pull together and agree on tighter rules of the road, as it were. So Anna, about your point about FNRB, that feels like that needs to be something that happens sector-wide. We all agree that the new default should be whatever it is, and everyone can adopt that together. At Burn, we're really trying to be one step ahead of the kind of methodology development side of things and make sure that we're adopting best practice as we see it in-house. So one of the things that we make sure we always try and do is ground truth the methodologies that we're using. So that means going into real people's homes and doing kitchen performance tests and making sure that our usage surveys aren't just, ringing someone on the phone and talking to them, but that we actually kind of following up with real life site visits, checking what's happening kind of on the ground, as it were. And in terms of, and above that kind of project flow that you were saying in terms of integrity all the way from stove design through to the end, Burn is quite unique in that we do everything ourselves. So we do all the R&D and the design and the manufacture ourselves based on real life customer feedback data that we get in terms of how stoves are used in practice in real life in the field. And then that flows all the way through our distribution, which we now do mostly ourselves, B2C, with network of field agents in 9 different African countries. And we have a kind of pre-registration phase where we're really checking in advance, are these people who are facing barriers to cook stoves? Are these people who are using primary charcoal users or primary wood users? And really making sure that we're distributing to the right people, which flows through in terms of the kind of quality of the project when you get down to the monitoring and methodology side of things at the end.
That's great. Thanks, Molly. Ken, do you have anything to add from your perspective in terms of those things the industry can do to keep the industry moving forward in terms of the quantification risks?
Yeah, what I'm more concerned about than anything else, I think, and it's really I'm focused particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, although we're working in 20 countries around the world. The great majority of our effort now is in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa, where we're installing 10,000 stoves a day in 5,000 households. Currently is an understanding of what is the real world efficiency of cook stoves, how traditional stoves are actually managed by women, and what the true environmental impact, local and global impact is of that efficiency, and especially of charcoal production. And what we find is that the current methodologies do not adequately attribute the emissions reductions from non-CO2 gases, and that the confusion over FNRB is quite an important confusion, because it equates national level data or regional data to what is actually going on in the communities that we serve. And the most important difference between the high levels of FNRB that you see in most Cookstove projects and the academic studies is that they don't take into account what is it really accessible to the woman or the ox cart that is gathering wood for village consumption. Women typically don't walk more than 5 or 10 kilometers a day. And the scarcity that should be reflected in FNRB is really what is accessible biomass to them and what the impact of that scarcity is on land degradation, especially agricultural land. Whereas the FNRB factors that are reflected in academic studies talk about the mean annual increment of forests that are quite often not under harvest pressures, or plantations which give rise to surplus wood, which is not accessible to communities. I think getting a better handle on the quantification of real scarcity is important to identify the credibility of the FNRB factors, and make sure that, yes, defaults are always important across all of these parameters. But the defaults also should allow tools to demonstrate that in particular circumstances, the actual scarcity or the actual efficiency of cooking in the real world can be demonstrated and presented to a credible, well accredited VVB in the carbon auditing process. I also feel that one of the biggest problems in Africa in particular, but also in other parts of the world, is an underestimation of the damage done by the charcoal trade. So better understanding of what the real wood to charcoal ratio is in traditional earthen kilns in an environment where the charcoal is either illegal or where the resource is free, and nobody's investing in efficient kilns or retorts, is really important to enable us to address that problem, which I think is the most pressing problem for deforestation and land degradation in Africa. I agree with Molly that from a quantification standpoint or credibility of cookstoves in their usage factor, it's really important to ensure follow-up. For every 100,000 households we serve, we have 120 full-time employees who do nothing but make regular visits to households over the life of the project, and ensure that women are using the stove, they have best practice, and they're repairing the stove. And we too make all of our stoves in our factories in Cape Town and Malawi, and are advanced in design to make sure that we're providing the most efficient stoves. But our ambition is to ensure that by the end of a carbon finance project, we can provide clean cooking solutions for basically the cost of a cooking pot, so that when the carbon subsidy runs out, we have truly transformed technology and behavior, and no young girl growing up in a household served by our stoves would ever have to go back to an open fire, because they can buy a clean cooking solution for the price of a basic good.
That's great. Thanks, Ken. And I think a couple of points there that both of you mentioned is around sort of the difficulty sometimes of ensuring that you know and have the real-time data of exactly how these stoves are being used on the ground, and making sure that sort of education and trainings being delivered to the end users. I mean, Molly, a question for you is in terms of, because what role do you think technology and improved technology can play in giving providers such as yourselves and Sequest more accurate real-time data to be able to monitor usage and help the end users on the ground?
I think we see that there's potential for remote technology. For the biomass stoves, that's practically a bit harder, and there have been some kind of pilots of things that you clip on that measure the kind of temperature and the duration of cooking time for biomass stoves, but they're not very accurate yet. So we're kind of watching with interest while that kind of matures. We still think there's a real role for going and visiting people in real life to provide the kind of all the kind of touch points that Ken was talking about. Where we've seen the real success of the kind of digital monitoring is with our electric stoves, which we've been piloting for the last couple of years. And those have IoT boards embedded, and those can monitor real time what you're cooking. And we really see we're in the process of registering a POA under Gold Standard's new metered and measured electric cooking devices methodology, which is brand new, and that should be really transformative in terms of being able to actually track energy consumption moving forwards. But let's see with the biomass, it's a bit harder, but I think we will get there.
Okay, that makes sense. And there's clearly, with all of these clean cooking projects, an incredibly human element that I think both of you have touched on, in terms of the human component of who is using the stoves and sort of how those people and households are being engaged with. And Ken, I was wondering, from your experience, I mean, what do you think is sort of best practice when it comes to engaging and involving local communities with these projects?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing is to follow up regularly. We like to employ, especially women from the local communities. We equip them with bicycles and smartphones. We use sophisticated global data capture and management information system to be able to record visits and see them occur, and the data that pops up in terms of our stoves being well maintained. Are people using them properly? Are they drying the wood? Are they opening up the kitchens to improve better ventilation? These data are all recorded by our stove champions who visit the households. And so they capture data, but they also continue to communicate best practice and try and understand what constraints there are, or what the wear and tear on the stove parts. What do we need to do to make sure that we continue a very high rate of usage? But we develop long-term relationships with our communities, because a significant part of our profits and a requirement of ours that anybody who buys emissions reduction from us has to give back a significant amount of money to our foundation for women, which is focused on recycling funds for women's education and health, financial literacy. And we're expanding our program of funding village savings and loans societies in the communities we serve, so that we can create a cadre of women entrepreneurs who can be also the agents of the high quality solar panels that we make in our factories in Cape Town, and provide good quality pots and pans and super pots, which are highly efficient cooking pots. So the relationship is established in that way, but also our whole focus is on empowering women to transform the way they produce food, and to climate-proof smallholder agriculture. So everything we do in Cookstoves is to free up time, 2-3 hours a day, increase health and productivity of women and girls, so they can be agents of change in agriculture. So increasingly over time, we're introducing agroforestry systems, creating woodlots, distributing seedlings. Every time a household is found to be using our stove well, we provide a bamboo seedling in Malawi, giving out millions of seedlings now, trying to ensure that they understand we're in for the long term and not just the life of a carbon project, to help transform their lives to be adaptive to a world challenged by climate change.
And I think one key question that comes from that, and I think is a key thing that we found in our work, is obviously the co-benefit outcomes of these projects can be huge. And as you were mentioning, there are incredible impacts that these projects can have in terms of the livelihood of particularly women in these communities. But I think one of the surprising things we found was that very few, or not all, clean cooking projects actually sort of emphasize, monitor and measure these co-benefit outcomes. From your perspectives, I mean, what have you learned about the best ways to actually quantify and monitor some of these SDG impacts outside of just the emission reduction?
Well, we spend a great deal of money on third-party research. For example, now we're spending about $350,000 alongside the Clean Cooking Alliance in looking at actual time savings across 4 countries that have our cook stoves. And that research is really fascinating. The baseline has been done with 4,400 households. And we are going into the time savings that result from the use of our stoves and getting a lot of insight on how we can communicate more effectively with our women clients. We've developed SD Vista asset methodologies for time savings, which allow us to provide an opportunity for those who are focused on gender benefits to allow women who save this time to sell the time forward and gain from local NGOs and others contributions to their agricultural production or to be entrepreneurs. So we fund a lot of research and we are very happy to do that. But the most difficult thing we find right now is to make the SD Vista program that issues independently verified labels work efficiently. We've been working for several years now with more than 30 SD Vista projects, and we haven't got the labels out, but that process is rigorous. It just needs to be streamlined to make it more effective in a market context.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And in terms of that quantification question, Molly, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then we might open the discussion up to public comments and questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as Ken's alluded to, there's more and more research going on about how exactly you should quantify co-benefits from cook stoves. We've been very lucky to be the subject of some kind of independent third-party RCT evidence. We're also conducting some research on gender co-benefits on some stuff around black carbon and kind of other emissions. And I guess, yeah, Gold Standard and Vera are both now possible to kind of have the co-benefits registered. But I suppose not all projects will be 100% there yet in terms of having all their co-benefits listed online. But that's something that we're seeing buyers asking for more and more. And I think that's definitely the direction that everything's moving in.
Great. Yeah, and that's definitely a trend we're seeing at Trove ourselves. I think finally, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I know a lot of participants have been putting some questions in the Q&A. So I think Tanya's going to run through a few of those now.
Thank you so much to our panel for the insightful discussion. As Tristan said, we're now going to open the floor for questions that were submitted by our audience today. There were a lot of good questions in the chat, so we won't be able to get through all of them, but I will highlight a few. The first question is going to be for you, Tristan. Some of our attendees have raised risks around double counting between REDD+ projects, which protect an area against deforestation, and clean cooking projects, which stop deforestation by reducing local need for firewood. How much of an issue has Trove found this to be? Are there registry mechanisms in place to stop this risk materializing?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and one that we've looked into a lot ourselves. There is clearly theoretical risk here. If you had a clean cooking project located right next to a REDD+ project, then the benefits from that clean cooking project in terms of the reduced deforestation could in theory be double counted. In reality, we just don't see this as a key risk and concern at the moment. We've compared the clean cooking locations to all REDD+ shapefiles using our geospatial analysis internally, and we haven't found a single occurrence of a clean cooking project being located within 5 kilometers of a REDD+ project.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I have another question that I believe would be best answered by Anubhav. Several questions have been raised when we discussed additionality. What are the inherent barriers to getting a cook stove? Is it primarily an economic issue? And why does project scale affect the likely barrier to adoption? Yeah,
I think that's a very interesting question. And I think taking the first part, which is whether it's primarily an economic issue or not. So when we talk about barriers, we've seen that yes, economic issue is a major barrier for communities to access better cooking devices. But at the same time, we've seen that in certain areas where access to markets, behavioral challenges to adopting a new kind of technology, or even the availability of tech within the region. So there might be cases where the people may have the ability to adopt a better stove, but they do not have the knowledge or the awareness or even the market systems to provide them those stoves. So I think apart from economic, behavioral challenges, behavioral barriers, and market challenges are other barriers that we've come across. And on the second part, which is about the inherent barriers and the scale, I think there's definitely a correlation between that, wherein we have seen that smaller scale projects generally occur in least developing countries or in rural areas. And these projects which occur in such areas have high inherent barriers to access better technologies for cooking. Whereas in non-developing, like in developing countries or in urban areas where there is access, the amount of inherent barriers to accessing a clean cooking technology device is lower. So of course, smaller scale projects have a higher inherent barrier as compared to larger scale projects, which are mainly located around developing areas vis-a-vis LDCs. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Thank you so much, Anubhav. And we're quickly running out of time, so I've just got one last question for Tristan. Someone has asked for our view on risks around reduced use of cook stoves over time. Is this a risk? How can it be mitigated?
Yeah, it is definitely a risk, and we see this is one of the key drivers of quality that we see in terms of sort of very high to low integrity projects. I mean, the risk here for us really comes down to a couple of things. There's firstly the extent to which sort of robust monitoring of usage has happened. If the monitoring has been very robust and representative, then that risk is fundamentally minimized because the accuracy and reliability of usage data is a lot better. And I think the second big mitigation factor here is something that Ken and Molly both mentioned earlier, which is in terms of community engagement. If projects have the right mechanisms in place to educate users in terms of how to use stoves, have the right mechanisms in place in order to make sure that when those users have any problems, they have someone that they can reach out to get support, then usage will be fundamentally a lot higher and that risk will be mitigated significantly.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I'm just going to pass over to Guy Turner, our founder and CEO, for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks, team, and thanks to guest speakers as well. It's been a fascinating hour, and although I've been around the market a lot, I have also learned a lot today, so thank you, everybody. And also, I'd just like to sort of conclude by saying that the voluntary carbon market is under a lot of scrutiny. It's under the spotlight, and we know that there is sort of work being done on this particular topic. But I would also like to say, in spite of the some of the risks that have been highlighted today, some of the quantification work that needs to be improved and ongoing, this sector is one of the success stories of voluntary corporate climate action. It has taken in a lot of capital. You've seen the level of effort, the work that's gone on behind the scenes to make lives better for millions, if not billions of people. And yeah, we need to get the numbers right. We need to make sure that the carbon reduction benefits are matched against appropriate sort of liabilities on the buyer's side. But I fail to see another scenario where this level of investment, this level of creativity, this level of action could be delivered through other funding mechanisms. It's the free hand of the market that is driving a lot of this innovation. and action on the ground. So, you know, I think it's we need to get the numbers right, but that's what markets are about. It's what voluntary action is about, for how to use capital, scarce capital in corporate budgets to the best possible effect. And to me, you know, I think we've done, you know, this sector demonstrates its innovation pretty successfully.
And just to speak a bit further on those thoughts, Guy has penned an excellent commentary piece available on our website that goes a bit more into those topics that he just addressed. But thank you everyone for joining today's webinar on cook stoves, and a big thank you to our lovely expert panelists, Molly and Ken, as well as the Trove Integrity Assessment team for all their work today towards today's session. As a reminder, a recording and the slides that you've seen today will be available tomorrow on our website. Please look out for future webinars and announcements from Trove Research on our LinkedIn, on our website, and in your inboxes. And we're looking forward to having you all attend our next webinar. Thank you very much.